All right, Brent, you can mute the pulpit again. It's always weird being on this side of everything and not being the one back there. I have to make little sprints back there to tweak things. Um, but I think Brent will do just fine for the day. So I don't know if any of you remember, I did a sermon some time ago called Christian Customer Service, and that kind of talked about how we are to behave as Christians in our interaction with the public, with the customers of the world, right? People that we see on a daily basis or interact with, maybe only once in our life, but if they know, well, even if they don't know that we're Christian, um, we should conduct ourselves in a Christ-like manner, and that makes a good impression on them. And then when they find out later in life, potentially, about Christianity from someone that they have a deeper connection with, they will be able to think back. Maybe they'll be like, oh yeah, that one really nice person that I met, I bet they were a Christian. They just seem like the kind of person, right? That's the kind of impression we. Um, this is kind of a sequel to that, not intentionally so, um, but it kind of ended up being on a similar topic and sort of. So I'm considering this kind of a sequel. So lately, I've felt impressed that I should become more active in the outreach activities that we perform as a local church. That wasn't it. Before I start considering outreach activities that might be overseas or, what we would consider these mission trips, right? I should do everything I can in my own local community because this is where God placed me. He chose through, a series of events that this is where I should live. This is where I should grow up. And he put me here because he wants me to be a beacon of light, to be a missionary here, which isn't as glamorous, possibly, as going on these overseas mission trips and saying, look at all the fun things that I did, and look at all the people we helped. We're helping people every day here. Every month we have harvesters. We're raising concrete so that we can more effectively do that ministry. And I feel that I should be more active in those types of outreach activities before I start considering trips overseas or to other cities, or there's one Brendan and I heard about at GYC that's in, was it Lansing, Michigan? Yeah. Like that'd be really cool to go to that and to go help pass out literature. They're looking for photographers and video editors, things that Brandon and I could do. But before I start looking at the neighbor's pasture, I need to realize that the grass is green in my own backyard. So that's kind of, in a manner of speaking, this is kind of this sermon and that idea are kind of what we covered last quarter in the adult Sabbath school lesson for those of you that were here for that. This idea of mission outreach, but it starts in our daily lives, and that's what we're going to look at today. So before we get into looking at the Bible, I want to define a few terms from the dictionary. We'll turn off the monitors. That one's coming through here, so shut that off for the lapel mic. Top row, green buttons. So a missionary, according to Wikipedia, actually, a missionary is a member of a religious group which is sent to an in order to promote faith or provide services to the people, such as education, literacy, social justice, healthcare, and economic development. Translation of the Bible, Jesus Christ says the word when he sends his disciples into areas and commands them to preach the gospel in his name. And he sends them out to other cities, to other places as missionaries, right? And this is what a lot of the apostles, missionaries, Paul and Peter, traveled all across, as much of the world as they could cover and their time, gospel message with them. And that's what a missionary is. But there's also, but we can also be missionaries locally. We just don't call them missionaries necessarily. At least by definition, that's not the most accurate word. We might call them an evangelist. So an evangelist is a person who seeks to convert others to the Christian faith, especially by preaching, right? Like a television evangelist. And we're not all called to do public speaking. Some people don't like being up here. And some of us are too comfortable being up here and should not be up here as often. So another definition of an evangelist, though, is a zealous advocate of something, right? He's an evangelist of health food, or an evangelist of the benefits of water. They zealously advocate for something. And I think that's something that we all should be, as we'll see later. And so finally, a disciple is a personal follower of Jesus during his life, especially one of the 12, or, more generally speaking, a follower or a student of a teacher, leader, or philosopher. And that is something that we can all be today. And we're going to look at what that means, because it's changed a little bit just because of the culture and the times, and the fact that there's not a physical person that we can leave things behind and go follow Jesus from town to town as he preaches to others. As cool as that would be, that's not really the way things work. So I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to change things up a little bit by, first of all, taking that off because it's hot up here. I'm going to come down here, and we're going to do this Sabbath school style. I'm not getting the whiteboard out, but I want to know, what are some things that you think are important characteristics of being a disciple? Does anyone raise a hand? Becky. Willingness to share. That's, even just willingness at all can be important. And we'll look at that in a little bit. Yes? Love for mankind. Love in general, but love for fellow mankind. Anyone else? I had 4. You've gotten 2 of them so far. Love for God. I grouped those together as just love. It's kind of a joint thing. Cody's got to move the cameras now. Humbled. I did not have that one. That is a good one, though. That's a good one. Anybody else? There's at least a 5th one I know, because I've got one that hasn't been named yet. Anybody? Anybody at all? Number 5? Okay. Number 5 is actually in the definition of an evangelist. A zealous advocate. They need to have passion. I'm doing that again at the end, Cody. So I had as my 4 definitions, zealousness, or as is called, a willingness to leave everything behind, right? Jesus calls his disciples and he says, leave this behind and follow me. And there's a certain passion or zealousness that you kind of have to be willing to do that. Love is one that was mentioned. Faith, following God, even when it doesn't make sense from a worldly or financial perspective, to quit your job and follow this carpenter from Nazareth, or from Nazareth, doesn't make sense physically speaking, but it makes all the sense spiritually speaking. And then to evangelize, to make more disciples. That's what disciples are called to do. And that was the last one. So let's look at some examples, because it's all nice to, think of a list, but it's just conjecture unless you can prove it with evidence. So let's take a look at Luke 14. And for those of you turning in physical Bibles, it's going to be towards the end of the chapter, verses 26 and 27. So this is a large crowd was following Jesus, and he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and child, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple either. So it's interesting, the use of this word hate. If anyone does not hate their own father and mother, or hates their wife, hates their children, hates even their own life. And hate is a strong word. It's a very strong word. And Jesus says, in another sermon, um, it's, the commandments say don't murder, but if you hate your brother, that's as bad. But now he's saying if you don't hate your brother and sister and father and mother and wife and child, then you can't be a disciple. So what does this mean? So I went and I looked at the Greek and I thought, well, maybe because originally I was looking at this in King James, and King James occasionally makes some weird translation choices. What I read to you just now was from the NIV. It says hate. Every version I looked at always translated this as hate. And the reason for that is because that's what the Greek word was. It meant hate. There's no other way to interpret that. However, this is the definition for the Greek word miseo that was used in that case. To detest, or especially to persecute, or by extension, to love less. And I think that's the key here. When I read that last part of the definition, it really explains what he means when he says to hate. If you don't love your father and mother, your wife and child, your own life less than you love God, or to say it the other way around, as long as you love God more than your father, mother, wife, child, your own life, if you're willing to give up all of that because you love this so much, then you can be a disciple. You have to love God more than anything else in your life, even things that you are justifiably, loving your parents is fine, or so I'm told. But if you don't love God more than you love your parents, or your dog, or your toys, or whatever the thing is, your car, your job, if you're not willing to give up those things because God comes first, because he's more important, then you can't be a disciple. So love for God above all else is a defining trait of being a disciple. One of the disciples. You cannot be a disciple without this. And as was mentioned earlier, love for fellow man is also very important on the list. So we are supposed to love our father, mother, children, wives, whatever, and our neighbors. And we've heard many times the example of who constitutes a neighbor. And for the purposes of this sermon, neighbor in this case is literal, because we're talking about being missionaries, evangelists, disciples in our own backyard, in our own daily lives. So yes, you should love the people who live next door to you, but not more than you love God. So that's first. But let's take a look at John 13. This is part of, this is during the Last Supper. And for those of you that have section headings, you'll see the section just before this is Jesus saying, someone is in this group is going to betray me. And Peter's like, who is it? Who is it? And he goes, the one that I give this bread to, whatever it was. And basically says, Judas is going to go betray me. And he runs out to go do that. And so after he's left, Jesus begins to share some final thoughts with his disciples. And one of these things that he says is, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By your love for each other, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So this is, we are told, a defining trait, right? If someone has love for their fellow man, for their neighbors, we know that's one of the signs that they're a disciple of Jesus. So if we want to be disciples of Jesus, we need to each other. Love God first, and then everybody else. But it's not enough to do all these things as Paul says. You can do all these great things, but if you don't do it without what? No, if you, yeah, okay. If you do all these things, but you do it without faith, then it's nothing. It's a sounding brass and clanging cymbal. So we're not going to go look at the faith chapter, but we're going to look at Luke 5, actually. This is a practical example of Jesus' disciples exercising faith in him, even though common sense would say, what are you talking about? That's not worth doing. So Luke chapter 5, he starts off, big crowd of people. We start out this way. And he gets so crowded, and all these people pressing in to hear the word of God being shared. And he gets basically pushed right to the edge of the lake. And there are 2 fishing boats left unattended. The fishermen are a ways off cleaning their nets, it says. And he's like, hey, we're going to borrow your boats quick. So he steps into the boat, and they cast off a little ways from shore. And as he starts to back away, he continues preaching, which makes me wonder if this is not the precedent for why the speaker is, separated on a platform, right? The crowd's down there, and then speaker is, there's a differentiation here. So he said, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. So this is a moment here where he could stop at that point and say, it's not, you're crazy. We're not going to catch anything if we try now. We just spent all night catching or trying to catch fish and couldn't. But he doesn't say that. Peter says, we've worked hard, haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the net. And that's such an important part. Because God told me to, I'm going to do the thing, even though to me, to my human brain, it doesn't make any sense. That's faith. That is believing that when God says he's going to do something, he'll actually do it, even if you, as a human, with our perspective, can't see how that would happen. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. And what happens? When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. They signaled their partners' boats, right? There were 2 boats. They both went out. They both put down their nets. They catch so many fish, their nets are breaking. They're like, hey, guys, come here. We got such a big catch. We got to come up. Sorry, we're too busy. Our nets are breaking too. Both boats, not just the one that, they both listened. They both received the benefits. And they filled both boats so full with fish that the boats began to sink. What a great problem to have, right? You listen to God, and now your boats are full to overflowing, and you got to make it back to shore from the deep water before your boats. I mean, he'll solve that problem too for you. But what a great problem to have, that the blessings poured out so full that you couldn't even handle all the blessings that God poured out for you. And that's the payoff, right? That's one of the signs of being a disciple, is in these moments when God says to do something and you think that doesn't make any sense, that's never going to work, and you still do it. That's the faith. That's the sign of this is an example of a disciple having faith, and it worked out well for him. So one of the other examples we're going to look at is this idea that disciples are told to go out and make more disciples, right? Or as we'll see here in John 15, we're going to look at John 15, 5 through 8. And there's other examples, of course, of this concept that we should be disciples, that we should continue out, or that as disciples, we should be making more disciples. There's plenty of examples of that. The Great Commission, of course, that we looked at as our scripture reading today, go and make disciples and baptize them and grow in number, right? So another way to phrase that is what we see here in John 15, verse 5. He says, I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. So it's this process of bearing fruit and address part about, staying connected as well, right? We have to stay connected with Christ, and when we do that, we are then able to bear much fruit, and that is another sign, much like love for each other, bearing much fruit is another sign of discipleship. So it doesn't matter how good your connection is with the vine, how much you love each other, but that bearing fruit, making more disciples, is also part of that. And that's something that we're all called to do, because that's not the work of an evangelist that goes out and does the public speaking part. There are other ways to win people to Christ, and we're going to look at some of those here in a little bit. But before we get into that, because that is rather an important part, we're going to go to the Old Testament quick. We're going to go to Isaiah, the first part of Isaiah, because Isaiah was definitely called to service, wasn't he? He ended up writing one of the larger books written by any of the prophets that we have recorded in the Old Testament. And his experience is it's interesting. So in the year that King Uzziah had died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on the throne. The train of his robe filled the temple. Isaiah 6, we're looking at the first 8 verses, if you want to follow along. Verse 2. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. So we might not all have that same reaction, but we would all probably have the same reaction in that situation. What I mean is, some of us may feel that we are or unprepared or incapable of being a worthy messenger, right? Well, if I go talk to somebody, maybe I'm going to mess it up and I'm going to say the wrong thing, or however that goes. And that's entirely possible. But we see here that Isaiah, when we get to the end, he goes from saying, woe is me, and this passage, and here I am, send me. So somewhere in here, he has this transition from I'm not worthy to I'm ready, I'm willing, send me, I'll go, I volunteer. So what happens? Verse 6 and 7. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. So it didn't matter that Isaiah on his own was inadequate or felt inadequate or unworthy to go and be a disciple or a missionary or a prophet in his case specifically. He was willing, and God did the rest. He was willing to go. He had that spirit of willingness. He just had a few doubts. God cleared that up for him and said, Don't worry, I will take care of you. I will do it. And he goes, Perfect, I'm ready. I'm going to go. So Isaiah was empowered as a messenger for God through this interaction that he had which, again, that connection to the vine is what empowers us to bear fruit and to love each other and to have all these other signs and to be disciples. And then he had a willingness, and God did the rest for him. Now, not everyone might be willing to serve, and that's all right too. As we're going to look at Exodus 3. And so, yeah, this is, well, it explains itself. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a burning bush, right? Moses saw that the bush, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn. So Moses thought, that's weird. I'm going to go look at it, that's what I would do. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. He says, go, right? Much like the go and make disciples. He tells Moses to go, and Moses said, okay, God, I'll see you when I get there, and left, right? That is absolutely not what happened. Moses was kind of the king of excuses. He had all kinds. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God basically tells him, it doesn't matter who you are. I'm going to be with you. That's all that anybody needs, right? He says, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of the land of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So even if you're not willing to be a disciple, there may come a time, and you might be able to get away with it for a while. Moses was a shepherd for a long time before God finally showed up and said, all right, time to do your life's work. But it also might happen soon. How better, I think, to be an Isaiah story of that willingness to go and say, I'm here, Lord, send me. Use me now how you want. Because we don't have much time left. We don't have 40 years to go be shepherds in the wilderness and then eventually be called to do God's work. We're being called now, and it's important for volunteers. But if God doesn't have volunteers, he'll call the people that he needs to call. And it's a cool story, but I think I'd rather be an Isaiah than a Moses. So I want to read a couple passages from Ellen White, 9th volume, Testimonies to the Church. I'm going to read page 21. There's a whole chapter in there on, chapter 2 is just titled, Called to be Witnesses. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but for the sake of time, I just want to read a couple paragraphs. It is not only by preaching the truth, not only by distributing literature, that we are to be witnesses for God. Life is the most powerful that can be advocated and works more harm of a world, for the purposes of a holy life. Men believe what the minister preaches, but what the church lives. Too often, the influence of the sermon preached from the pulpit is counteracted by the sermon preached in the lives of those who claim to be the truth. It is the purpose of God to glorify himself in his people before the world. He expects those who bear the name of Christ to represent him in thought, word, and deed. Their thoughts are to be pure and their words noble and uplifting, drawing those around them nearer to the Savior. The religion of Christ is to be interwoven with all that they do and say. Their every business transaction is to be fragrant with the presence of God. So even if you weren't convinced before, hopefully these words that are written much better than what I would have come up with, hopefully that convinces you that discipleship is not something that happens at church. In fact, there's did some additional reading on this. There's a website called Catalyst Collective that has a 4-part discipleship strategy. And they point out that it begins outside the walls of the church. The process of discipleship does not begin when someone decides to follow Jesus, but rather when someone decides to allow a follower of Jesus to meet a need in their life. So we start this process by looking at those around us, finding needs that they have, and doing what we can, either individually or collectively, to meet those needs. Because that is how you start to build trust. That's what Jesus did, right? Many times we see these examples. He finds someone who had an ailment, who was sick in some way, and he performs a miracle and heals them. And we might not be able to do that ourselves, but that there are other things that we can more easily meet the needs of, right? It's cold out. This family needs blankets. Let's do blankets. These kids are sleeping on the floor. Let's build beds and give it to them. And there are, giving food out to people in the community. Doing these things helps build rapport with the community. And you have to have that rapport. You have to have that trust before they'll start to listen to the other things. Oh, it's nice that, your God died to save me in my eternal life, but I can't feel my toes right now because I'm cold and I need shoes that fit. And so you need to address those physical needs first before they'll start to listen to the spiritual needs. So what are the unique needs in the community we're targeting? What are the unique needs that we have here in Kingsville, here in Holden? We could partner with Lee Summit Church. What are what needs do they have in Lee Summit? What needs does Warrensburg Church have with their group? What are things that we can do together to meet needs in our local community? Specific things that are issues here. We have to stop trying to be all things to all people and instead look within the walls of our church to assess what our God-given talents our people have and see how we can help the people. And thus, how we can meet the non-spiritual needs first. Because once those have been met, and it's a great way to build integrity and trust, then 6 to 12 months down the road, you can start to talk to that person about spiritual things, and maybe sooner if they're truly searching. But it's necessary first to address physical needs, and this goes back to right, because they're saying we should examine what our skills, what our abilities are as a church. We talked about before a couple years ago when I did a sermon on spiritual gifts and I had everybody take a survey. And if we need to do that again, we can. But look at what am I capable of doing, and then we can look around at the community and we can say here are the needs that I find, and we can match the right people to the right needs. And if we need to look at a Summit or Warrensburg, be like, hey, they've got some people that are really good at this. Let's work with them. We can help some of your people meet their needs, because we're all working for ultimately the same goal. And it doesn't matter specifically, but where you were placed here. So we should look in our own neighborhood before we start looking at other areas. What is Iowa doing? Well, Iowa's gonna, we can help them, but we should really focus on our own local communities uh, first, I believe. So, um, yeah, so I want to look at some practical examples. Begin with who is already in your life. Think about the people that you see every day: family members, coworkers, longtime friends, neighbors, church members, your high school friend you keep in touch with on Facebook, the cashier you see at the gas station every week, even acquaintances, right? And you start small, but you start strengthening some of those relationships. It doesn't have to be everybody on that list, but you pick a few and you say, okay, here's the ones I'm going to focus on. During the 10 days of prayer that we just had, we were encouraged to pick, was it 5 or 6 names, 5 or 6 people, and you start praying for them every day, or something specific or in general, but pray for them every day. That's a great place to start. Start doing that as well, but also start making efforts to reach into contact with them more, and saying, being friendlier with the cashier, chatting with the cashier a little bit more when you go in to get gas or something. And you start with these small things, but you start building these relationships of the people that you're going to focus on initially. Pray for them, ask about their lives, make meals for the people in a time of need. If you're going to Target, take somebody with you. People need to know that you care about them and their lives, about them and their lives, before they will start listening to you about your faith. And that is actually from the Pretty Simple Ideas blog, 5 things I'm learning about modern day discipleship. That list and that suggestion comes from there. So find out something that complements your particular spiritual gifts. And that's what the sermon a year ago was here's what the spiritual gifts are, here's the different things that people have, and hopefully there was some information in there that would help you better be able to identify those types of things. And if we need to do a refresher on that sometime, we can do that. If you can't tell, most of my sermons are basically on this one topic, on being disciples, being missionaries, being evangelists, being zealous advocates of our faith and how it can help other people that we see. Paul's appeal to Agrippa, that was the last one I did. How to give your personal testimony, right? Power of prayer and how to have a strong prayer life, which is, of course, the foundation of anything we're going to accomplish as Christians. We already talked about the spiritual gifts sermon. The biblical art of meditation was one I gave a long time ago. And that talked about the importance of personal devotion and having time each morning to connect with God before anything else. We've talked about love and what it means to love your neighbor. There was a whole sermon about that. Write them on my heart. Talked about the change of heart that we need to have as Christians so that in our daily interactions, God shines through us and they see his character and not our own flawed characters, our own hearts of stone, which is accomplished through personal time with Christ, which is what the one before that was. And perhaps most importantly, building character for heaven, which goes hand in hand with being a good example to those around us that we interact with. But this goes a step further than just building character that we will take with us to heaven. This is about being intentional about sharing that character and witnessing to others and discipling them. So I want to leave you with those thoughts. Pick some people in your local, in your week that you see. Pick a few. Start praying for them every day. Start getting to know them better. Find out what needs they have that you can help with. And if you need support for that, come back to church next week and let us know. That's what this is. This is not just a time for us to gather together and, be Christians. This is a support group for witnessing to others. So if you have concerns or ideas, or if you need help in some way, that's what your church family is for, is to support you in that, each and every one of you. So, yeah, I just challenge you to remember that. But now we'll do our closing hymn, which is Seeking